think about how I was going to do this word that God had asked me to give you, I began to see that this was going to take far more than one Sunday. Maybe if we were having that potluck today, I could just keep going right through the meal, as Paul probably did. But, so this is going to be a series, I believe, on the things that God has done for us. Because, again, these songs that I picked out this morning, I think we've become far too familiar with God. And yes, there's that side, that intimate side of our relationship with God, where He says that we cry out, Abba, Father, Dad. But on the flip side, it's kind of like a marriage. I've been married 30 years next March, haven't we? And in any marriage, you become very easygoing with each other. And sometimes, I think that especially bothers women. I'd imagine if I asked our hands, a whole bunch of women would raise their hands. But we just become, and listen, I don't necessarily think in marriage that's completely a bad thing. I think it's great when you can sit around together, and be comfortable. But in our relationship with God, it is important that we don't get too secure. And last week I spoke about God's protection and His companionship amid our storms. Now, Paula has told me that I am no longer allowed to preach about storms because, as some of you have heard, every time I preach about a storm, we have one of our own at the house. And we certainly had one with our dogs and getting out and biting. And so this last week, but last week I said there is nothing too small for our God to care about in our lives, and nothing too big that He can't handle. And this morning I'm going to begin to focus on the greatness of God and what He has accomplished for us. But I want you to understand, I know that some of you are going to say, well, he did this. This is not an exhaustive list. When I get through with this series, I hope it will go all the way through Thanksgiving and into Christmas, because obviously the greatest gift that He gave to us is His very own Son. Now, most of my sermons are ones that call us to make a change in our lives. I've been taught from very early on that that's what we're really supposed to be doing, is changing and submitting and becoming holy. However, this series is much more informative in nature and gives us a better understanding of God's mighty works on our behalf. Now, some of you during this series are going to say, why is he telling me things that I already know? I'm going to give you some surprising statistics about biblical illiteracy in America. Fewer than half of Americans polled could name the 4 Gospels. Many Christians cannot identify more than 2 or 3 of the disciples. There were 12, by the way. 60% of Americans can't name even 5 of the 10 Commandments. Kind of figures that we can't keep them if we don't know them. Here's one that really irritates me. 82% of Americans believe that God helps those who help themselves is a Bible verse. Is there anybody here? Don't raise your hand. That was Benjamin Franklin, who was a deist, and he wrote that in Poor Richard's Almanac. The whole point of the Bible is that God helped those who couldn't help themselves. Now, I will say that people that identify as born-again Christians did better on that one. Only 81% of us said that that was a Bible verse. 12% of the people polled believed that Joan of Arc was Noah's wife. Love that. 50% of high school seniors, maybe Seth, you want to take this poll and do this with your class, thought that Sodom and Gomorrah were husband and wife. And the last one that I put down here, a significant number of those polled believed that the Sermon on the Mount was preached by Billy Graham. Now, I will say he probably has preached the Sermon on the Mount, but I think they meant initially. And I'm sure that Billy would be horrified by that fact. And listen, we should expect that non-Christians would know less about the Bible than they did years ago, given the fact that we're increasingly taking it out of every aspect of our government and educational systems and becoming more anti-biblical society. In fact, this week I just saw that the Supreme Court was taking up a ruling about a veteran's cross that was up. However, the fact that Christians are increasingly biblically illiterate is intolerable to me. As Albert Mohler, president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, puts it, how can a generation be biblically shaped in its understanding of human sexuality when it believes Sodom and Gomorrah to be a married couple? No wonder Christians show a growing tendency to compromise on the issue of homosexuality. Many who identify themselves as Christians are similarly confused about the gospel itself. Because an individual who believes that God helps those who help themselves will find salvation by grace and justification by faith to be alien concepts. Christians who lack biblical knowledge are the products of churches that marginalize biblical knowledge. Bible teaching now often accounts for only a diminishing fraction of the local congregation's time and attention. The move to small group ministry has certainly increased opportunities for fellowship, but many of these groups never get beyond superficial Bible study. Youth ministries are asked to fix problems, provide entertainment, and keep kids busy. How many local church youth programs actually produce substantial biblical knowledge in young people? Even the pulpit has been sidelined in many congregations. Preaching has taken a back seat to other concerns in corporate worship. The centrality of biblical preaching to the formation of disciples is lost, and Christian ignorance leads to Christian indolence and worse. I think this fits in with if you're visiting, you guys, you can look up on the back here, and you'll see our 4 tenets of a church: teaching, prayer, fellowship, and breaking of bread, which we find in Acts chapter 2. And I refuse to allow this church to become part of that statistical problem. So this morning and several Sundays after, we're going to look at different areas where God manifested his greatness within the books that we have been given him, by him. Since we're coming up to Thanksgiving and Christmas, I believe it's even more important to remember what God has done for us. And we're going to start in the very first book in our Bible, and the very first chapter and verse. Genesis 1 and 2 says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while the wind of God swept over the face of the waters." How many of you have never heard it said like that? Because this is the NRSV, and I love how it pulls out some of the meaning in this. It gives us a better understanding of this first look at our Creator. Because, see, God began this process before we come into the picture. Because, did you notice it said, in the beginning, when He created the heavens and the earth. So, God began the process by creating the heavens and the earth, which He originally created as a formless void. And I like to think of it as a potter, if he were able, which he is not. But if he were able to make his own clay, his own dirt, or clay, or whatever that is, if he were able to actually make it before he started sculpting it, that's what God did. I think that it's important here to state something that each and every one of us must come to grips with. Because I know some of you, it's always a good idea to try to answer the question that's going to pop into people's mind before they ask it, if you're a preacher. Otherwise, if you're like ADHD like me, then you never get off the question and hear the rest of the stuff. So, I don't know whether God accomplished all of this in a 24-hour day cycle. Or whether the days equaled thousands of years. And contrary to popular opinion, neither does anyone else. While science gives us their opinions as to the Earth's age, I don't know if you've known this, but they've been known to be wrong before. When I was in high school, we were told by scientists that we were going into the next ice age. And then they came up, not that long ago, with global warming, except many parts of the earth are actually getting colder. And so they changed it to what? Climate change. They've been known to be wrong. And they give understandable explanations. Now, there's a website that you can go to when you get home or when you're thinking of something to do. It's called answersingenesis.com. And I actually had it on the screen, but our screen went out. That strictly adheres to a 24-hour day. It's actually put together by scientists that are also Christian. And they give understandable and repeatable explanations as to how a 24-hour day can be believed. But when it all comes down to it, they weren't there either. In the end, the important thing is to understand that we weren't told all of the particulars. But we still have to trust the author. When you go buy a car, they didn't tell you how they built it, did they? They just said, here's our car, you can count on it. Especially if it's a good salesman. In this case, we have to trust the author. So God made the heavens and the earth, and then began forming and filling them in, which is where this historical documentation begins. And the NRSV says a wind, or the Spirit from God was over the waters. And this statement is designed to show us that God was even then. Remember that His name is Jehovah, which is translated, I am. See, He was, He is, and He always will be. That's what we have right here. He is the Alpha and the Omega. The Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He was before all things and will be after all things within creation. And then we move on to verse 3. Then God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. God, wouldn't that be amazing? God spoke the light into existence. Now, I will admit I have Alexa at home, and I can say, Alexa, turn on the family room lights, and she will. It's not the same thing. He just spoke, and light became real. But why did God separate light from darkness? Did God need that? No. He did it for us. He did it for the rest of his creations, which he would then create. We need the darkness as much as we need the light. One day, when we're all in heaven and we get a new heaven and a new earth, we won't need the night. But currently, we need the night as much as we need the day. And for those of us who work nights, Crystal, you work nights, right? It is hard to adjust, isn't it? It is. In fact, it was really funny because I wrote this part before Paula reminded me that there was daylight savings thing. And I said, wow. I said, in fact, this 1 hour, how many of you woke up an hour early anyway? How many of you woke up at 6 something? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing our internal clocks need the night. Take note that light was created prior to the sun, moon, and stars. There's something most non-Christians wouldn't realize. Light and later sun, moon, and stars. And then also take note, if you're going to be taking notes, that God said that what he created was good. There weren't any errors in his creation. There was no evil and there was no sin. And God doesn't do anything poorly. I kind of imagine God standing back at what he had done and goes, that's cool. We've got a guy. David, you're back there. So David is very, very creative. Both of them are, Lori and David. But you ladies, he did those things for you, right? That you do. So do you ever sit back and go, hey, that's pretty cool, after you've created something? Yeah, right? It's natural. And God said, hey, this is good. And then we go to verse 6. And God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the water, and let it separate the waters from the waters. So God made the dome and separated the waters from that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. And God called the dome sky, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. Now, as most of you have learned, I'm very visual. So in my brain, I picture it like the parting of the Red Sea sideways. Right? You can imagine that, right? And then you just got, right, the stuff in the middle. The empty space in the middle. I think that when you visualize things, it helps you hold on to them and remember them. But all in all, for your second day, that's not a bad day's work. And then he goes on, God said, let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So on the third day, God causes the land to appear. Now listen, I don't know whether he caused it by having volcanoes blow up and build, like we see, the big island of Hawaii is still growing. It's the youngest of the Hawaiian Islands, and it's still growing because the volcano keeps blowing up and making more land. So, I don't know whether he did that or instantaneously it just happened. But I do know this, it didn't happen by accident. Notice once again that God looks at what he's done and says, it's good. Verse 11. And God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it. And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and the trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning, the third day. Now God, he's caused light to happen. So what happens when you put plants in the complete dark? They die. So he's already created light, right? But remember, he still hasn't created the sun, moon, and stars. 3 days, and he hasn't even done that yet. So light is there, so plants can grow and thrive. And notice that he put in place the things necessary for living creatures to survive before he created the living creatures. Just as God has already put in place everything that each of us needs to succeed with anything that he tasks us to do, God is a great boss. Because when he asks you to do something, he never ever asks you to do it and doesn't give you the skills or the people or the tools to accomplish it. And once again, he looks at his handiwork and says, it's good. Verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the great light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day. See, he's already put light into the world, but he gives us the signs for a light. You know, it's interesting when you read for those of you that like science fiction movies like I do sometimes, I'll say, oh, if the sun goes up, the sun's going to go out, and everybody here is going to know there's not going to be any light. Well, I just read creation. If that were to happen, we'd still have light. I don't know how. But God said he created it before he created the sun, moon, and stars. Our God truly is indescribable. He speaks things into being that are exactly what we need for our existence and our prosperity. How do I know that it's exactly what we need? Because God looked at it and said it's good. That's pretty simple, huh? Now I want to do a quick tally. So we've got 4 days done. We've got waters, heavens, earth, land, and seas. Plant life and heavenly bodies. And all of it was good. Verse 20. And God said, let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky. So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 5th day. Day 5 sees the creation of every creature that lives in the sea and every bird that flies in the air. And again, everything God made was good. So I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you, in this context, what do you believe is good? A definition of good. What? You can go ahead. Well, we don't know what those are. You know, I'm guessing if a sailor saw a whale shark, he'd say that's a sea monster. Don't you think? Bigger than their boat? We don't know what they are. We do know Leviathan is mentioned several times. That means big sea creature, water monster, whatever. We don't know what they were. But we do know he says it's good. And I believe that a really good definition of good in this context is that it's something that performs the way that it's supposed to. When God created these things, they were exactly as planned, and they performed exactly as predicted. In fact, many of you remember that during our Bible studies we talked about when God said, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as my Father in heaven is perfect." When Jesus said that, that word perfect actually means be complete. It doesn't mean without flaw. Without flaw is Latin, but it was written in Greek. And the Greek word means complete. To be what God created you to be. The end product of what He created you to be. And I believe this is the same thing that He means here. Everything that was there, it was made in a way that it was just going to work. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Now, Donnie, you can see that in this definition of everything was the way it was supposed to be, and performs the way that it was supposed to be, that snakes and spiders and all those kinds of things would be said to be good, even though if I don't want to have any of them in my backyard. Right? So it's a better definition of good. On the sixth day, all of the land creatures are created. And here's something I find very interesting. And someone may have to look this up. Maybe Brad, Mr. Google can get this. But I find it very interesting that wild animals and cattle are spoken of as separate creatures. Did you find that interesting? Why? Weren't they wild? Okay. I don't believe, certainly now, it would be the case now, but I think that most scientists would tell you that cattle weren't always domesticated. Right? They'd say at some point they were wild animals. But see, he separates them out. Isn't that interesting? And God says that all of them, every species and every animal, were good. Now I want you to notice there's another living creature that's been separated out from these others, right? Mankind. We weren't created in the same group, in the same way, none of that. We were created entirely differently with a different purpose. See, all of these other things were created for us. But we were created for Him. Verse 26. And God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So you see, he created us in his own image. What does that mean? Image. In God's image. What does that mean? You know, scientists say, well, we're different because we have impulsive. That's not the whole. Listen, that's not the true essence of what's different. We're different because he gave within us a mind to think and to reason. And he gave within us also the ability to choose to do right or to do wrong. This is the creation account, breathed from the very mouth of God to his servant Moses. And when God had finished all of this, once again he said, but this time he says, it's very good. It's very good. So what does this account show us? It shows us how incredible our God is and how much he loves us, that he pre-prepared everything else that was on this planet for our existence and for our enjoyment. And just as last week we saw how Jesus spoke to the wind and the waves and they obeyed, so in creation God speaks and everything comes into existence out of nothing. It's important that we not only hear what God has done, but be able to convey God's goodness and his glory throughout the world. We're going to later in several Sundays hear about what God did in the land of Egypt. And you'll recall when they left and they were going into Canaan, the people said there, we've heard of what this God has done. We've heard of the plagues that he brought upon the people of Egypt. And they were scared. You see, it's important to tell people what God has done.